Is Brian Shaw really trying to kill athletes with his event selection for the Strongest Man on Earth 2025? Let me take you through my analysis and offer my opinion on how I would structure the events to minimize the injury risk to the athletes. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. Today, we're going to talk about The Strongest Man on Earth 2025 and the events that Brian Shaw just released. Now, first, I want to say is good on Brian Shaw. Thank you for releasing these things as early as you did. When you see the events, which we'll go through in a minute here, you'll understand why it's important to release these because it's going to be a brutal contest for the athletes. And so giving them the most amount of time to prepare their bodies is going to increase their performance and also reduce the risk of injury. So got to give a shout out there. We're still at a point where in the sport that events aren't released until, too close to contests. And so, in my mind, that in itself is going to increase the injury risk, when you're at the top of your performance and pushing your body beyond your limits, right? So now that's great. But when these events were released, it stirred up quite the commentary online. I've seen videos from Mitchell Hooper, Paul Dwyer, Terry Hollins, and Uncle Laws and Auntie Liz, all commenting on them. The sentiment I get is that, this contest is, too heavy. Maybe there's too many maximum effort events. But, that was my original, my kind of initial gut feeling as well, too. But I wanted to kind of lock that away for a bit and do more of a formal analysis because maybe if you didn't know, I published this book recently, and I've included data in there that kind of describes the typical distribution of motion patterns and effort patterns for strongman contests. So I thought, well, why don't we compare the events in terms of how they've been chosen for the strongest man on earth, and look at the kind of average, strongman contest, the typical strongman contest, if there is such a thing, because there's no standards. You can pick whatever event you want, but nonetheless, we can still compare it to see if anything is wildly off base here. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get into it. Okay, first things first, we should definitely go through the events, at least the amount of details we've been given from Brian himself. All right, so as Brian said, in no particular order, here we have a max log press, a standing chest press, with the really cool keg loaded chest press machine that Brian and his crew have built. Number 3, there's a frame deadlift, some kind of side handle deadlift that seems to be for a maximum effort. We have a frame carry into an arm over arm pull. Next up is a safe carry. Brian says this is a custom implement, but it's basically like a heavy ass super yoke walk. Okay. Number 6 would be the manhood stones. Awesome to see these returning. I'm not sure if anyone will get the 600-pound stone again in this crazy of a contest, but it's awesome to see that the opportunity is there. Number 7 is a keg toss for max weight. So we saw it for max height before. Now it's for max weight. That's a nice, interesting spin on it. And lastly is a medley, which is the last. This is the only event we know the position of for sure, which will be the last event, which is a tire flip, and it goes into a power stairs. So a nice medley there to end the contest. So you see the contest has 8 events, but it's actually testing 10 skills, right? So there's 2 medleys, and each of those test 2 different skills, at least how I would classify them. So you have 10 overall. Just as a little aside here, when I looked at amateur contest data, and one of the studies I presented, Foundations of Strongman Training, the average number of skills tested per contest was 5 plus or minus 2, right? So that means that most contests tested, 5 on average, maybe up to 7 for most of them. This contest has 10 skills it's testing. So I'd have to say, and Brian Shaw has always been a big proponent of this, of testing the guys in a well-rounded manner. So when you have a contest where there's just 4 or 5 skills tested, sometimes you don't actually test athletes in a well-rounded manner. They can pick contests with certain events that they're not good at that won't be there, and you can kind of hide weaknesses in your game. But something like this, there will be no hiding, right? So everything's going to be out in the open. You're going to be tested in a well-rounded manner, or at least that's the hypothesis. So let's keep going with the analysis and see if that is the case this time. So we have these 10 skills here for the contest. Now, in order to analyze them, what I would like to do is look at their motion patterns and the effort patterns for each of these skills. In case you don't know what those are, the motion patterns describe the set of positions that the athlete or the objects will need to move between. And the effort patterns are going to be the set of forces that you'll need in order to complete the task you're trying to do. Now, in the book, I aggregate motion patterns into something called motion pattern classes or groups. And then same thing for effort patterns, right? So the concept here being that, we can talk about the deadlift motion pattern class, and that would cover all of the motion patterns for barbell deadlifts, axle deadlifts, car deadlifts, and everything else that looks like a deadlift. And the task is to, move something from the floor up to hip height, right? So that's the kind of level of analysis that I want to do here is at the motion pattern class and effort pattern class. Now, in the book, um, when I looked at literature, I didn't find much of any definitions, categorizations for motion pattern classes or effort pattern classes. So I proposed my own. So let me just very quickly run through what those are so that you'll have that background knowledge for when we go into this analysis a bit more. So on the motion pattern class side, I proposed a set of 9 motion pattern classes. Here they are. Let me just run through them real quick. The first one is press. Press is, as you could imagine, you're going to move something with your arms away from your body. Most of the time, it's not a bench press in strongman, it's an overhead movement. Okay. Carry is the next one. You're basically going to pick some object up and carry it down a course. That one's pretty easy. Load, you're going to pick an object up and load it over something or onto some platform. Okay. Deadlift, hopefully you understand that one. Like I said, you pick something up from the floor to hip height, stand erect at the end, get your down signal. Next is push pull. So this means either you're pushing an object down the course and obviously it has contact with the ground, or you're pulling it, sled pulls, things like that. Next is throwing. So this could be like a keg or a sandbag toss. Could be where you're throwing something down a course instead of over some kind of standard. Flip is, you might imagine a tire flip, fingers. Basically, you're turning an object end over end, right? Usually 180 degrees at a time, sometimes more. So that's flip. Next one is squat. Squat, I hope you're familiar with as well. It's what you do every day when you sit down on the toilet. So, same kind of thing. Strongmen are tested with that, but very heavy. Okay. And the last category here is a grip hold, which basically is anything to do with manipulating objects with your hands. So it could be holding it like a Hercules hold, an isometric, right? You're just trying to resist motion. Or it could be, like a phone book tear or something like that. An anvil deadlift, like where you're actually trying to, manipulate an object, and the grip is the most important or limiting factor in the movement. So those are the motion pattern classes I proposed in the book. As I mentioned, there was also no effort pattern classification system, so I proposed my own there. So let's go through those quickly. First is fastest efforts, which is basically, synonymous with a traditional dynamic effort. In strongman, you have a time limit. Typically, you're going to have to complete the task as fast as possible. So that's number one. Number two is repeated efforts. That's a standard one. Basically, you perform the most amount of repetitions as possible in some given time limit. Next is maximum effort. So that's where we typically, if it's a static lift, you're going to pick up the most amount of weight. That's kind of changes with some strongman events. We will get into that. Furthest effort is number 4, and that's basically as far as possible. So you see stuff like a shield carry or something in strongman. you have to move this for as far as possible. Typically, there's no time limit or it's a very long time limit. And lastly is isometric efforts. So think like a Hercules hold, a car deadlift hold, something like that, where you're just holding something isometrically. Wrecking ball hold that we saw at Giants Live. World's Strongest Man is another one. But basically, you're holding some implement for as long as possible. So there you have it. That's the motion pattern classes and the effort pattern classes. Now we're going to use these because in the book, the studies I did, I've analyzed the distribution of these across a whole bunch of contests to basically come up with the typical distribution. So what I want to do now is compare the events of the strongest man on earth in terms of their motion pattern classes and effort pattern classes to the typical and see if there's anything that sticks out that is, not the same as the typical. So the first part of the analysis is to actually classify these skills. So I'm going to show you them here, and then let's go through my classification in terms of motion patterns and effort patterns. So, these are in no particular order, as Brian Shaw said, but let's go through them. First one is max log press. Okay, so in terms of motion pattern, we have a press. In terms of effort patterns, we have a maximum effort. That one's pretty, easy to understand. Next is the standing chest press machine. That is a press in terms of a movement pattern, and it's a repeated effort in terms of a effort pattern. Now here we actually might see for some people it's like a maximum effort, but you can always ask yourself, what are they being measured on? Now, when we saw this in the past, they were being measured on number of repetitions. So, there was a nice banner that said number of repetitions to beat if you watch the live stream. And so that means that it's a repeated effort, although that the weight increases and we might actually, we're it's kind of like a hybrid between repeated and maximum effort. But for the sake of this classification, we're going to call it a repeated effort. Next, the frame deadlift. My understanding is that this is going to be a maximum effort, and I've heard some good speculation that we might see some insane weights on this. Very cool. Very excited for that. And then obviously it's a deadlift in terms of motion pattern. Next, we have the frame carry into the arm over arm pull in terms of the. So there are two different skills here, right? The frame carry and then the arm over arm pull. So for the frame carry, it's a carry in terms of motion pattern class. And the arm over arm pull is a push pull in terms of motion pattern class. Now, this event is under a time limit, I'm assuming here. And so it'll be a fastest effort in terms of both of these skills. Moving on to number 5, this is the very heavy super yoke safe carry apparatus here. So obviously it's a carry in terms of motion patterns, and it's a maximum effort in terms of the effort pattern, or at least that's what I took away from listening to Brian Shaw talk about it. Number 6 is the manhood stones. So in terms of motion pattern, we have a load here. In terms of effort pattern, I think this one's as well kind of a hybrid. But I went and looked at how this was scored before, and it's scored on number of repetitions with a certain stone. So again, if you're not sure, always go back to what are the athletes being measured on? Here it's on repetitions, but obviously like these weights are very heavy stones and they're going to approach the maximum, like a one repetition maximum, for most of these athletes, or at least they could try it if they wanted. But still, they're measured on repetitions, right? So if they have enough time and they pick a light enough stone, they could get multiple repetitions. Okay, so got a repeated effort for that skill. Next up, we have the keg toss, and this is for max weight. So obviously, it's a max effort, and in terms of motion pattern, it's a throw. And lastly, here we have the final event, the medley, the tire flip, and the power stairs. Both of these events are going to be fastest efforts. The tire flip is obviously a flip type of motion pattern, and the power stairs is a carry type of motion pattern. Now, someone might argue here that the power stairs is a load, right? You're picking up an object and loading it onto a platform. That's actually not a bad argument. You also might look at this as a deadlift motion pattern because, you're taking something from the floor, although it's not like it's an elevated deadlift, and you're deadlifting it up to you then scooch it onto the stone, right? Or onto the platform. But I think about this with how would you talk about it? Would you say, "Hey, man, can you deadlift that object up the stairs for me?" Probably not. Would you say, "Hey, can you load that object up the stairs for me?" Maybe, but kind of sounds weird. Most likely, it'd say, "Hey, can you carry that heavy ass object up the stairs for me?" Right? So, anyways, that's what I'm going with here. I'm going to say that the power stairs are a carry motion pattern class. All right, so now that we've classified these skills in terms of motion patterns and effort patterns, it's time to compare them to the typical or average, or at least the numbers I found in my book. If you have different data that you want to compare this against, let me know. Happy to do it. I'd love to see something contrary. But I've been researching the sport for a long time, and I haven't seen any scientific studies that um, gave me, this kind of data to compare against. But nonetheless, let's use the data from the studies in the book to do a comparison. So if you see here, let's first look at motion pattern classes. On the left, you'll see the motion pattern classes, their titles. In the middle column here, you'll see the data from Foundations of Strongman Training. So I put these here. This is basically these columns, this middle one and the one on the right will represent the number of skills. So in the book, I've laid out percentages, but here I've just kind of calculated them to what does that mean for skills out of 10, because that's how many skills are in the strongest man on earth. So we go through them quickly. For the press, you'd have 2.3 skills. The carry is 2.2. Load is 1.5. Deadlift is 1.4. Push pull is zero point 0.9. Throw is zero point 0.6. Flip is zero point 0.4. Squat is zero point 0.4. And grip hold is zero point 0.3. So that would be if you could, have skills be represented by partial skills. This is what the distribution would look like. Now, we can't have partial skills, right? So they have to be round numbers. So let me kind of set up what the typical contest would be by looking across different motion pattern classes. So if we convert these now to something that might represent reality, where we have whole numbers for skills, we can kind of look at these grouping. So we're going to have, between press and carry, we should have 5 skills, right? They're about equal in terms of the distributions, but we're looking for roughly 5 skills between press and carry. For load and deadlift, there should be 2. Could be 2 loads, 2 deadlifts, one and one of each, but roughly between the two, we should expect 2 skills to be tested in these motion patterns. We should have 1 push pull skill. Between throw and flip, one of those should be tested, and between squat and grip hold, one of those could be tested. Now, the squat and grip hold are actually happen pretty infrequently, but here we're being generous and saying, maybe one of them should be tested. So let's go to the last column now, and you can compare between, this kind of typical contest, what we might expect to see, what the data showed me looking across large numbers of contests, and what we see with the strongest man on earth events. So if we go down the list here, we have 2 press events, 3 carries, 1 load, 1 deadlift, 1 push pull, 1 throw, and 1 flip. Now, if you look at those compared to the kind of heuristics that I made up before, we do have 5 skills between press and carry. We do have 2 skills between load and deadlift, so we're good there. We have 1 push pull skill. Okay, that's great. Throw and flip, we have 2, and then squat and grip hold, we have 0. So, looking at these numbers, I'd actually say that's a pretty, in terms of motion patterns, that's a pretty well rounded contest, right? So 10 skills, it's a lot to be tested on. Mind you, it's over 2 days. So that's a little bit easier, but things are so heavy, so maybe that takes away from the 2 day effect. But when you look at the table here, it's like not far off from the typical, right? Maybe what we might have is we might move one of the throw or flips into a squat or grip hold just to, like, hit these heuristics that I've made up here. But I'd say it's pretty well rounded. Great contest in terms of motion pattern classes. All right, now let's compare on the effort pattern class front. So I'll show you another table here. On the left, you're going to see the names of the effort pattern classes that I proposed in my book. And then the other two columns, again, are the number of skills, and here we're thinking a number out of 10. So in terms of what I found in the book, the typical proportions or distribution of these effort pattern classes from top to bottom, we have fastest with 5 skills out of 10, repeated with 3 skills out of 10, and then maximum with 1. And then between furthest and isometric, we would expect to see 1 skill, either a furthest or an isometric, something like that, right? So that's the typical that I captured from looking across contests. Now let's look at the last column, the strongest man on earth events, and see what we actually have. So what we have is 4 fastest, 2 repeated, 4 maximum, 0 furthest, and 0 isometric. So that gives us our 10, right? Now, as I kind of mentioned before, I think 2 of the events are kind of like a hybrid and almost a maximum event, and maybe for many competitors they will be like a true maximum effort, because these guys are competing to be the best, the strongest man on earth, right? So they're going to lay it all on the table. So even though it's we might call it a repeated effort event, they're going to give it a maximum effort, right? They're going to push themselves until they break. So that's why, technically here you see that we categorized, 4 maximum effort events, but there's a couple that I think make that potentially 6 if you want to categorize them that way. But let's just, stick with what I categorize now, and you can keep those kind of caveats in mind. So in terms of fastest, the typical contest, would have 5 out of 10. This one has 4. Okay, that's pretty good. Repeated would have 3. This one has 2. Okay, not bad. Maximum, usually there's 1 maximum event out of 10. And if you've ever done strongman, you can imagine why you only have 1 maximum. Not only does it take, like, usually a long time to get through, in terms of, so you have like the audience watching this maximum event for a long time. But it's also very hard on the athletes to do multiple maximum events, right? Maximum effort events. In this contest, we have 5, and I said, potentially 6. And then furthest and isometric, there's 0, right? So there's no as far as possible or, holding something as long as possible type of efforts in this contest. So here, I think, is this highlights the kind of concern that others, in the spotlight in the sport are raising with this contest. There is 4, at least from my my official classification here. There's 4 maximum effort events. That just 4 of them. That's a lot. You see here we expect 1 typically. So 4 times the amount of that. That's a really brutal way to have a contest. Now, there's some things to think about here. These people, strongmen are people, they get to choose, right? So it's 4 maximum events, but maybe you don't max out on all of them, right? You have to be strategic here. And typically with a max event, you actually have that option, right? You get to pick the weights to some degree. Sometimes there's like a minimum, a starting weight, but you can pick when to jump in, or sometimes you can pick the exact jumps you want to make. And so you can play some strategy there. On paper, they're max events. We would love the athlete to just push themselves to the max here 4 different times. But that might not be possible or feasible without like some big injury risk. And so I think you'll see that maybe 1 or 2 of the events, the guys are actually like a true maximum effort. And I'm going to talk about in a second how I would lay out the contest to encourage that. And then the other 2 max events will be, more of like maybe like a 90% maximum effort because, there's just 10 skills. And if you have two true max efforts on some really heavy stuff, how much is left over, and you got to be strategic. And there's clearly an injury risk there that you're trying to mitigate. So, that's how I think the athletes are going to be approaching this. But, anyways, this is the part that sticks out to me like a sore thumb here, right? So we expect one on average maximum event, and here we have four, potentially six of them. Okay, I know that all sounds scary. Oh, there's four max events. There's maybe six. People maybe would quantify seven in there. People are going to get hurt. You know, everyone. I mean, if you're worried about injury risk, then just don't participate, right? There's all kinds of people who would love the opportunity to go. Now, that being said, I think that we should try to mitigate the injury risk for the athletes as much as possible. Brian Shaw so far has not said the layout of the events. All we know is that the last event will be the tire flip and power stairs medley. So what I want to do is if I, had the opportunity to lay these events out that would try to minimize the injury risk, that's what I want to do. So right now I'm going to offer you, my thoughts on this, how I would go about it. So promise, this is the last table you have to look at. So here's the table of how I would lay out the events. You see here, there's day one and day two. Let's just go through it and I'll give you some of my reasoning. Day one, we have the frame deadlift, standing chest press, manhood stones, and then the frame carry into arm over arm pull. Day two, we've got the safe carry, the super yoke, keg toss for max log press, and then the tire flip into power stairs is the final event for the contest. Now, I would lay them out this way for a few reasons. Let's go through them. So on day one and two, I would put in any contest for strongman, you want to put the heaviest weights at the start, in my opinion, to minimize the injury risk, because that's when the athletes are the most fresh, right? They have the most energy and they're the least beat down. Now, because there's so many events, it's 2-day contest. Day two first event is going to be like really hard. But still, I want to follow this principle. Let's put the events with the heaviest absolute weights at the start. So on day one, that's why I picked frame deadlift, right? So do the frame deadlift first. People are talking about, 500, 550, 600 kilos. That's a lot of weight to be deadlifting. So let's put that at the start, and then, you can see how things go there. But at least you're the most fresh to do this massive deadlift. I think that would be the most entertaining, in my opinion. And I think probably the athletes would love the opportunity to try this, new style of deadlift and actually truly max out on it as the first event when they're the most fresh. So that's why I put that first. Next, I picked standing chest press because basically it's going to give your body a break after these massive deadlifts you just did. You're standing, sure, but all the weight is on your upper body, and you just, you're kind of doing a constrained press, right? So it basically gives your lower body time to recuperate while you can still put maximum effort into getting as many of those kegs pressed as you can. Third on day one is the manhood stones. So, although this one you might consider is somewhat of a max effort if you actually attempt the larger stones for most of these guys, it's measured on repetitions. And so, we went from a very heavy lower body, then we did a, pretty heavy repetition event on the upper body. Here with stones, we're going to combine it both together. So hopefully that chest press in the middle gives you enough time to recover. And with some good strategy, maybe you can get a few reps on some stones this year, especially for any of the guys coming back. And then lastly, you're going to end with a fastest effort, right? So hopefully Brian Shaw doesn't make those, fastest effort ones, the medleys, too heavy. So then you kind of end the day, you're, burnt out from all of these maxing out these heavy, loads. And then you end with, trying to move fast. So typically that means weights are a little bit lighter, right? So maybe, not a 900-pound frame carry, but like a 750 or something. And then, you'll see guys get some decent times with it. So, anyways, that's how I would lay out day one. Day two, so same principle. Start with the heaviest absolute weights. It sounds like this safe carry. I think Brian did say something like it wouldn't be quite as crazy as the bale tote carry we saw at the Arnold Strongman Classic a bunch of years ago that potentially ended some careers and caused people big problems. But it's going to be pretty heavy from my interpretation. So let's put that one first, right? Just like the heavy ass frame deadlift, we put the heavy ass yoke walk first. Okay, so there's that one. Next, I picked keg toss because although it's for max weight, the absolute weight will be like I think fairly light compared to all of the events, right? So maybe people will be, throwing over 100 pounds, over 15 feet, maybe 120, something like that. But 120 pounds compared to like, 1,300 pounds or whatever from the day before or for the super yoke, the event before, will be like kind of like a little break, and athletes can also use that one to gauge themselves. So if they're super burnt out, maybe they don't max out, to be honest, for this one. They just get some points on the board and save the energy for the next two events. Okay, so keg toss is there. Next, I would do the max log press now. So basically, you have this really heavy lower body was first event. Now you have an upper body one, but it's throwing, and the absolute load is fairly light. And then you go into this max log press. So hopefully, just like when you got to the manhood stones in day one and day two, you're kind of, recuperated as much as you can in a contest like this to then go out and do the most weight on the log press that you can do. And then finally, we know this will be the last event. You go into the tire flip and power stairs. Again, I think watching it last year, this is the power stairs part. It's like brutal, but guys finished it. And so I think as long as the tire flip is like reasonable in terms of the weight and the number of flips you have to do, I think this will be a good fastest event. So again, you're ending with like things that hopefully weigh a little bit less. They're going to tax you. This is strongest man on earth. It's Brian Shaw. It's going to be hard, but hopefully the weights are reasonable so that guys can end the day by moving fast and fight with each other on those on the time limit, just like we usually see with like an Atlas Stone, run being the last event. It's about like trying to get guys moving fast and compete for time, not for max weight to end the event. All right, so with that being said, that's how I would lay it out. That is why, and I think doing in this manner would kind of, or hopefully, reduce some of the injury risk. I talked about where you could rest, where you could kind of be strategic. Now, that being said, I think that if I had the opportunity to change any, one event or something, what I would do to make this maybe not so brutal is I might change the max log press to a medley or 4 reps. I think that would just maybe even set the mindset that the weights you're lifting are a little bit lighter. If it's a medley, you can still like force guy. The Shaw Classic, Strongest Man on Earth, did log medley before, and I quite it. Log press is my favorite event, so I love that. But that way, guys can just like kind of pick, what weight they want to do. They don't have to have this feeling of like, oh shit, I got to max out again because so and so is here, so and so is going to be pushing me. You can like maybe more make it like a fastest effort, right? More dynamic, and it's still going to be, very challenging, whether it's for reps or as a medley. But that's kind of the if we took the structure I made, I would also say we should change that from a max to one of those other two effort patterns. And then I think the contest is like really well rounded and still brutally hard. And but hopefully you minimize that injury risk just that little bit more. So there you have it. There's my analysis. We compared it to the only data in the scientific literature I know that's out there. I happen to be the author of that data. How convenient, right? So hopefully that gave you a different perspective on like analyzing events and how to draw conclusions about whether they're appropriate or not. I'm not saying what I said is appropriate, but you can have your own opinion on it. I also gave you my plan of how I would lay out the events and maybe some changes or strategies I would apply to try to mitigate the injury risk. So, but, at the end of the day, these guys are all competing for the title, the strongest man on earth. And so this challenge should be brutally hard. You shouldn't be able to just walk in, it should be limited to a very few men on earth that can walk in and even just perform these events, let alone like perform and win this contest. And I think that this contest is going to be that. It's going to be brutal. And I'm sure Brian Shaw and his crew are going to do everything they can to try to minimize the injury risk and, take care of the athletes on the day. So, you know, in the end, I think as a fan, it's going to be so exciting. As an athlete, I hope all of you guys make it through there, unbroken. I hope we don't see any big injuries. And, should be a great contest. I'm looking forward to watching it. So there you have my analysis. If you think I did a good job, let me know. If you think I didn't get anything right, also let me know. But I think that this is going to be a really entertaining contest to watch nonetheless. Thanks, everyone. Take care.